she lived with him while he was superintendent at West Point. But it was shortly after that they received the news that Mrs. Custis had died, George Washington Parke Custis' wife. And so Mrs. Lee then returned back to Arlington House because now her father, who was well over 70, was frail and in need of help. And so she decided to return to Arlington House and take care of her father. It was also at Arlington House where 6 of the 7 children born to the Lees was born at Arlington House. So they had a big family on that large estate. In 1855, Lee was given command of the 2nd Cavalry and sent to Texas in 1855. And then in 1857, he received the news that George Washington Parke Custis had died. And so then he returned back to Arlington House and took a leave of absence from the Army because he was executor of the estate of his father-in-law. And so he wanted to go back and make sure that estate was taken care of. Now by this time, in 1857, the estate had kind of diminished in its stature because Custis himself had gotten old and kind of not very demanding of the slaves and the people who worked on the estate, and so the estate was kind of run down. And as Lee came back and saw that, he realized that it was going to take him some time to get the estate back in order. And he had a very good motivation for doing that, because under the terms of Custis's will, the property title went to his daughter. But also within his will, he had given $10,000 to each of his grandchildren. That's the good news. The bad news was, he didn't have $10,000 for each of his children. And he also said in his will that in 5 years he wanted to free all of his slaves.
No.
So Robert E. Lee knew that as the executive of the estate, if he was going to fulfill the wishes of his his father-in-law, that he was going to have to get the estate back up in order, get it functioning again, and making money again. And he had 5 years to do that, because he said, I got 5 years that I still got these 200-some slaves that I can use to help rebuild the estate. And that was his goal. So he had taken a leave of absence from the Army to get the estate back in order, and he was making great progress on it. Did in fact make great progress on it in a short period of time. So in 1859, then, as he was out working, let's go to the next slide. So back then, this is the house that was the home for Robert E. Lee and Mrs. Lee from 1831 to 1861. So in 1857, when he's up there and trying to rebuild the estate, this is how you came into the estate. It was up this long, sweeping driveway from the front. Today, if you go to Arlington House, you can't go up that hill. John Kennedy's buried right in front of that house down there on the side. So there's no road there. You approach Arlington House now from behind. But back then, you had this long, winding lane that came up from where Longbridge came across the river. So Robert E. Lee out there one day is out working in his yard, and he sees this lone rider coming up the lane in a military uniform. And so as he comes up, he sees it's his old classmate from West Point, Jeb Stuart. And Jeb Stuart said that Winfield Scott, the commander-in-chief, or the general-in-chief, it was his title then, of the U.S. Army, wanted to see Robert E. Lee, had a special assignment for him. So Lee gets on his horse, he goes back with Stuart back to Washington, and meets with General Scott. And General Scott says to Robert E. Lee, well, he wasn't a colonel yet, captain, I think he was, Lee, I have a special assignment for you. There's a scoundrel has taken over an arsenal up in Harper's Ferry, and I need you to go up and capture him. And of course, that scoundrel we know was John Brown. And Lee did that. He went up and made quick work of taking back the arsenal and capturing John Brown, and eventually John Brown was hanged for that. But it was the first time that Robert E. Lee had gained any national attention for what he had done in that mission, was to capture Robert E. Lee, or John Brown. So now Lee has gotten a fairly good reputation, and he makes the decision that the estate is in pretty good shape now, and he feels that he is comfortable enough, because he's got older children too, that he can go back into the Army, and he does. He returns to full service, and goes back to Texas as commander of the 2nd Cavalry. This is in 1860, he goes back. Well, as we know, 1860 was an election year, and that was the election, of course, Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. It was also a time in our history when there was a great deal of tension between the North and the South, when the issue of states' rights, the future of slavery, all came to a head in that election. And it became even more of a concern when Lincoln was elected, because the Southerners thought if Lincoln got elected, that for sure he was going to abolish slavery, although he never said that as part of his campaign platform. But they were concerned that that was going to be an issue. And so Southern states started looking at their options. And finally, and at the same time, if you recall that even though Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, he didn't take office, wasn't sworn in until March of 1861. Today we have inaugurations in January, but back then the inaugurations took place in March to give people time to travel from all over the country to get back to the capital. So between the time Lincoln was elected and the time he took office, President Buchanan was still in charge. Well, President Buchanan wanted nothing to do with trying to solve the issues of going on between the tension between North and South. So in December of 1860, when the South Carolina seceded from the Union, Buchanan did nothing about it. He didn't want to address that issue. He was going to leave that for his successor, Abraham Lincoln. And at that time, Robert E. Lee wrote a letter to his sister, and I want to read just a portion of it to you. He said, says, a union that can only be maintained by swords and bayonets, and in which strife and civil war take the place of brotherly love and civility, has no charm for me. I shall mourn for my country and for the welfare and progress of mankind. If the Union is dissolved and the government disrupted, I shall return to my native state and share the miseries of my people, and save and defense draw my sword on no one. So Lee was obviously concerned about the dissolution of the Union, and the last thing he wanted was to dissolve the Union. But needless to say, things got out of hand as Southern states seceded until February 1st, 1861, when Texas seceded from the Union. So here was Robert E. Lee, commander of the Union forces in Texas, and now Texas isn't part of the Union anymore. So that, what am I supposed to do now? And so he wires back to Washington, D.C., and is given the command to return to Washington, come back to Washington. So he left Texas on February 13th and got back to Washington, D.C. on March 1st. So Robert E. Lee now has returned to Washington on March 1st. Well, on March 4th, Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated as president. Okay, so now all of these pieces are coming together in terms of what's happening in the country. On March 28th, Winfield Scott, with the consent of Abraham Lincoln, promotes Robert E. Lee to full colonel. This is the highest. This is what everybody aspires to, who is a career military person, is to get to that higher rank, to become a colonel. And so on March 28th, he is promoted to full colonel because Lincoln and Scott saw Lee as a potential field commander, knowing that if anything was going to happen, and there was probably a pretty good chance there was, they were trying to line up people who were going to be in place to help lead the Union Army if something happened. And so everybody was, of course, concerned about what was happening at that time. I think we'll see where we are. We talked about Lee and his career and the places he went. Next. So on April 12th is when the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter. Suddenly there was hostilities. There had been some rebel forces, some rebels, I don't even know what they would call them, force. They made the first shot on Fort Sumter. On that following Monday, President Lincoln decided to call for 75,000 volunteers to serve for the Union Army. And the intent of that call was to have these volunteers, these forces, go into the South and protect federal assets, to protect courthouses, post offices, forts, and other federal assets in the South from attacks like they had just seen at Fort Sumter. The same week, the legislature went into session in Virginia to consider secession. So now, secession wasn't something that was going on down in the Deep South. This was something that was right at Lee's doorstep, that Virginia was considering secession. On the 18th, Lee got a call in order to come to Washington, D.C. and to visit with Francis Blair. Francis at Blair House. Francis Blair was part of Lincoln's kitchen cabinet. He was a well-known Marylander who now was living in D.C. He lived at Blair House, as we may know. Blair House is right across the street, or down the block, from the White House. Today, Blair House is the official guest residence of the United States government when a head of state comes from overseas. But at that time, that's where Francis Blair lived. And his son was Postmaster General, but Francis Blair was a good friend of Winfield Scott, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, the General-in-Chief of the Army, and Abraham Lincoln. And so Lee gets to go visit Blair, and Blair informally offers him command of these 75,000 volunteers that had just been called up. And which meant, of course, that he would be in charge of leading these forces into Virginia and other southern states to protect federal assets. Well, that was obviously a big decision for Lee. Lee said, I'll have to get back to you on this one, because he knew that it was going to change his life forever if that happened. And so he went back to Arlington House, and that night he pondered the question. He actually stayed up all night. His family was downstairs in the drawing room, and they could hear him walking back and forth across the wooden floors in his bedroom. In fact, it was reported that he stopped every so often, and they assumed that he was praying, stopped to pray, looking for some guidance from above as to what decision he should make, whether he should do what every career officer wanted to be, which was a field command. You know, that's what you want. On the other hand, did he want to lead forces that were going to basically invade his home state and other states? And so he finally made the decision that he was going to resign his commission. And he wrote this letter to General Scott. General, since my interview with you on the 19th, because he had met with him on the 18th, yesterday, the day before, I felt that I ought to no longer retain my commission in the Army. I therefore render my resignation, which I request that you recommend for acceptance. It would have been presented at once, but for the struggle it has cost me to separate myself from the service in which I have devoted all of my best years of my life and the ability that I possessed. During the whole of that time, more than 30 years, I have experienced nothing but kindness from my superiors and a most cordial friendship from my companions. To no one, General, have I been so much indebted as to yourself for uniform kindness and consideration, and it has always been my ardent desire to meet your approbation. I shall carry with me to the grave the most grateful and recollection of kind consideration, and your name and fame will always be dear to me. Save in defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword. Be pleased to accept my most earnest wishes for continuance of your happiness and prosperity, and believe me, most truly yours, Robert E. Lee. So Lee obviously resigned his commission, not to take any other commission. There was no Confederate Army to take part in, and no other position in the Southern militias had been offered to him when he signed that letter of resignation to General Scott. So then the next day, Lee gets an invitation from Governor Lecter of Virginia to come visit him in Richmond. So Lee then on April 22nd leaves Arlington to go to Virginia, to go to Richmond to meet with the governor. Little did he know on that day, April 22nd, 1861, that he would never return to Arlington House. He met with Governor Lecter, and Governor Lecter offered him the command of the Virginia militia, which Lee accepted. He felt that if he could take that position, he might be in a position then to not only protect his state, but help maybe negotiate some kind of peaceful end to the tensions, because there really had not been much more than what had happened at Fort Sumter by that time. So, so Lee left and stayed in Richmond, and then he wrote a letter to his wife back at Arlington House and said that perhaps it might be a good idea that she would leave Arlington House. Tensions were growing. It was clear that if hostilities broke out, Arlington House was going to be a very strategic place to have, to control, because it did sit on top of that overlook of the Potomac River and could control the Potomac River and perhaps parts of Washington, D.C. as well from there. And so on May 15th, Mrs. Lee did leave Arlington House and visited with her cousin who lived down at Ravenswood Estate, which was down farther south in Virginia. Then on April 24th, Union soldiers did occupy Arlington House. And so it was clear then that the Lees were concerned then not only about the condition of their estate, but the condition of the Western memorabilia that was part of that estate. And so Mrs. Lee wrote to Irwin McDowell, who was the commander of the Army of the Potomac that was stationed at Arlington House, and basically asked him to take care of their property and to ensure that nothing happened to the Washington collection, because that was near and dear not only to the Custis family but to the country. And of course, McDowell would feel the same way, that they did not want to disturb that. And nobody felt that this war was going to go on forever. That it might be a couple months, maybe through the summertime, that there would be some this tension, and if any hostilities, they'd be quelled quickly because there was no Confederate army yet, and the Union Army would take control of things and everything would be over. So she wrote to General McDowell, and then General McDowell cordially wrote back and said, Mrs. Lee, do not worry. I respect your property. I respect the collection. I will take care of it and secure it so that nothing happens to it. Well, that was his best intention, for sure. But of course, Arlington, the estate, then became a fortress. It became a lot of soldiers were bivouacked out on the property and going in and out of Arlington House as a headquarters. Well, if you can imagine, if you went through a building and you were a 22-year-old or a 19-year-old soldier and you saw, oh, there's George Washington's, shaving cup. Well, I think I might just take that. And things did start disappearing then from the house. And McDowell was concerned about that. So he did finally, after several months, order all the collection packed up and shipped over to the National Archives. But not before some of it had disappeared. At the same time, as you can imagine, the soldiers that were stationed there were using the resources of the estate. They were cutting down the trees for firewood. They were slaughtering the cattle for food. They were taking the crops and eating them and using them as they needed to. So there was a lot happening on the estate that was changing the estate, the property that the Lees knew. Also, then in 1864, Congress passed an act called an Act for the Collection of Direct Taxes in the Insurrectionary Districts of the United States. Essentially what that meant is that if anybody was considered a traitor, the federal government could take over their property. And of course, the Lees were considered traitors. And they had already taken over the property. Now they just wanted to get title to the property. And so the property tax, it was assessed value was $26,810. And the property taxes were $92 a year. Kind of like what we pay now for property tax a week. So the law also said that property taxes had to be paid in person by the title holder of the property. Well, in this case, the title holder of the property was Mrs. Lee. Lee never owned the property. Mrs. Lee always was the title holder of the property. And she was fairly disabled by this time, using canes and wheelchairs. But even if she could have gone, she would have been going behind enemy lines, and that would have been, disastrous for her. So she asked her cousin, Philip Kendall, if he would go to the courthouse in Alexandria and pay the property taxes, which he did. But they would not accept them from him because they had to be paid by the property title holder. So the property was declared in default, and the United States government took title to it on January 11th, 1864. Okay. So now what we're looking at is, this is basically what the property was in the Arlington estate, and essentially this is where the cemetery is eventually going to be established. But around Washington, there was a perimeter of 13 forts, 13 fortifications that were set up around Washington, D.C. to ensure the safety of the capital. And two of those forts were on the Arlington estate. Fort Myer, which is still there today, and Fort McPherson, which was there and then was stopped. And so there were a lot of battles took place around Washington, D.C., both in Virginia and in Maryland. And Washington, D.C. essentially became a city of hospitals. Every public building in Washington, D.C. was turned into a hospital, including the United States Capitol. In fact, it got so bad, and the fatalities were so many, that they ran out of cemetery space. There were no public cemeteries, no national cemeteries at that time. In fact, it got so bad that as Congress came into session in 1864, as they arrived on the steps of the Capitol, they saw bodies stacked up out on the lawn of the United States Capitol. It was such a need, and that became such a scandal for the Lincoln administration that they knew they had to do something about it, because 1864 is an election year, and Abraham Lincoln was going to be up for re-election, and so he knew he had to do something about this. And so Congress passed an omnibus bill that essentially set up the national cemetery system, that the federal government would set up national cemeteries as needed, and they would come under the jurisdiction of the Quartermaster General of the United States Army, who of course reported to the Secretary of War at the time. And so at that time, next slide, at that time, Edwin Stanton was Secretary of War, and Montgomery Meigs was Quartermaster General. I'm sure most Quartermaster Generals are the guys who are in charge of supplies. They're the ones that make sure you got your ammunition and your tents and your shovels and your horses and your wagons, and now your cemeteries. And so Montgomery Meigs, who had gone to West Point with Robert E. Lee, even though he was a Georgian, he considered Robert E. Lee a traitor. Those two of them were always competitive throughout their careers, and Robert E. Lee always seemed to get the promotion that Montgomery Meigs never got. And so by the time we were this far into the war, Montgomery Meigs had headed out for Robert E. Lee, and he had suggested that when they were looking for cemetery space, he's the one that said, let's put this on Lee's property. And Stanton, of course, quickly agreed. So on June 15, 1864, 150 years ago this year, Stanton signed the order to turn 200 acres of that 1,100-acre estate into a cemetery. So, but if you go to the records in the cemetery, the first burial in Arlington took place on May 13, 1864, more than a month before Edwin Stanton actually signed the order to create the cemetery. So it was clear that there was an intent to use that property as a cemetery long before it was ever officially made a cemetery. So when we look at the map now, this is roughly the 200 acres that created the cemetery, okay? Was this 200 acres. Here's Arlington House right here in the middle of it. And then Fort Myer, which is, you can't see, is off the map up here, and Fort McPherson was up in this part of the cemetery. So